United Church of Christ, our denomination, is in contact with members of the United Church of Japan to find out what their needs are and how we can help with the recovery process and the relief processes that will be taking place. So there will be more news about that coming up in the newsletter. So watch your email for that. And hopefully we can participate in that generously. The other is, some of you are familiar with AA and NA. They have a monthly magazine called, ironically, Grapevine. And AA has never taken a political stance. In fact, one of the basic claims in the big book is that it will not take political stances, that the only thing that people should come to AA for is to deal with their addiction. But the latest issue, as you can see, is almost an entire issue on LGBT people and addiction. And they actually come out in favor in support of all equal rights for gay and lesbian people, which is a huge step for this organization. And what fascinates me is the way that they explain it. It's not a political decision for them. It's not a doctrinal decision for them. It's about what people learn in the AA community, which is to accept people for who they are. And that could be a huge lesson for the church. A huge lesson for the church. So, anyway, good news, and I have a copy of this if anyone wants it after the service. I want to talk about the temptations of Christ. I want to talk about the traditional disciplines of Lent, and I want to talk about this thing called obedience that seems to be the focus of so much that we read, for instance, in the Gospel today and in many of the readings throughout the Lenten season. The three temptations of Christ. I'm going to suggest actually that there are four, but the three that are dealt with in the Gospel: greed for wealth, lust for power, and unlimited immediate satisfaction of our appetites, money, power, sex, whatever, the latest product of your favorite computer company. All of these things, they tempt Jesus in the desert. But they tempt us as well. I think sometimes when we read stories from the Gospel about Jesus, we tend to think about Jesus in the role of a hero. But he's not. A hero is a kind of superhuman person, the Arnold Schwarzenegger type, the Jean-Claude Van Damme, somebody who does a little bit more than anybody else can possibly be expected to do and takes on heroic tasks. Hercules in Greek mythology. Stuff that no ordinary mortal would be expected to confront. And yet everything that Jesus confronts in his life is what all the rest of us confront in some form or fashion. And in the desert, he's confronted with those three things that are constantly confronting us. What do we do with our money? What is this greed that we experience, not just for money, but for all kinds of other sources of enjoyment? And how do we deal with power when we run across it or it is foisted upon us? In Jesus' day, when the gospel writers were writing the four gospels, lust for power immediately called to mind Caesar. In 2011, there aren't too terribly many people lining up to be president of the United States, or president of Russia, or president of China. Lots of people, however, would love the power of being a celebrity. The way that power works in our lives changes from time to time and culture to culture. The point is that a hero wouldn't deal with these kinds of problems because they're just the ordinary problems that human beings face. But Jesus deals with them one by one. And it's easy to read the gospel and say, well, Jesus going out in the desert in order to be tempted by the devil, and then he gets put to 3 tests, and in each one he's obedient and faithful. But I don't really think that Jesus went out into the desert and said, okay, now I'm going to go get tempted. Should be fun. I think I'll need 40 days to get ready. I think he went out into the desert to get ready for his ministry and to reflect on the things that had just happened to him, his baptism in the Jordan River, and then start his ministry. And then, of course, that's when the temptations happen. I said a minute ago that I think there's a 4th temptation. Some of you are familiar with Nikos Kazantzakis' book, The Last Temptation of Christ. You may have seen the movie. The movie's not like the book. I mean, it's based on the book. But in the book, The Last Temptation of Christ, the last temptation is to avoid all temptation. It is to get away from it all, to get away from the cross, to get away from his followers, to get away from confronting injustice in the world, and to find that nice little cabin in the woods with the lover and the vineyard and the garden, and to hell with everybody else. That's the last temptation. In Kazantzakis, Jesus is tempted at the end of everything to just say, to heck with it. I just want to be myself. I don't want to deal with the real world. Whether it's greed or power or satisfying our appetites, it would be easy not to have to deal with any of those things if we just had that little place where we never had to deal with anybody or anything and to escape. A lot of people think of religion as a form of escape. But it's precisely when it becomes a form of escape that we've given in to temptation. The 3 disciplines of Lent traditionally are the ones that we read on Ash Wednesday when we read from Matthew's Gospel, and Jesus talked about prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And as I pointed out Wednesday, those 3 different disciplines, however we choose to apply them in our own lives, are not meant just for Lent. Jesus didn't say that in an Ash Wednesday sermon. He said it in the middle of his ministry. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving are guides for keeping ourselves in a healthy relationship with God, with our own self, our own bodies, our own needs, and a healthy relationship with our neighbors. Fasting is not about giving up food, it's about making the right choices. Prayer is not about getting right with God, it is about listening and thanking and enjoying. And almsgiving is not reaching down in our pocket and seeing what we don't want to spend at the bar tonight, but can afford to give to the poor. Rather, it is, what is our generosity about? And how do we express it? And does it make a difference in the lives of others? 3 temptations, 3 disciplines. Most scholars down through history, most sermon writers will tell you that this little trip into the desert that Jesus has constantly disobedient toward all kinds of authorities, constantly challenging. How do you tell good from evil? How do you know what to do in a situation where the decision you have to make is difficult? To whom do you listen? When is it good to challenge established rules? When is it right to stand up against injustice? And how is it right to stand up against injustice? When are you tempted to hide who you are? When are we tempted to be dishonest with ourselves and others? I don't want to focus on what happens in the desert and then what happens afterwards. I want us to focus on what happened before this temptation story and then see the temptation story in light of that. Remember what happened at the end of the Christmas season, and we brought the Christmas season to an end with the feast of the baptism of Jesus. The same words that we heard last week at the Feast of the Transfiguration. Jesus goes to the River Jordan to be baptized by John. He's plunged into the river by John. We hear this voice, "This is my beloved." Jesus' identity is proclaimed to Jesus and to everybody there on the banks of the Jordan. And he takes that sense of identity into the desert. And I would suggest to you that those three temptations are temptations for him to forget who he is, to forget who he belongs to forget that he is beloved of God and should have nothing to fear. That 40 days in the desert and that little visitation by Satan at the end, and those mountaintop experiences where Satan offers him everything he could ever want now. That's not about, here's a rule, let's see if you want to break it. It's about, who are you? It's all about getting Jesus to forget who he is, to forget his identity, to set aside his being beloved. The great reformer Martin Luther noted that in the Catholic churches of his day, and our day too, if you've been in a Catholic church lately, when you go in the doors at the back of the church, on either side there are bowls of water, and people are constantly coming in and dipping their fingers in the bowls and making the sign of the cross, the purpose of which many Catholics have forgotten, but the purpose of which is to remind them that they are baptized. And Luther once, in a sermon, preached this, and then after that he started giving it as advice to people who had to make difficult decisions in their life. He said this: when you have something difficult that you have to decide, when you have some distressing time occur to you or to your loved ones, dip your hand in the water, make the sign of the cross, and remember who you are. That, I believe, is the message of Lent. It is an invitation to us to remember who we are. In a Bible Belt culture, which will look at what happened on the wildfires of Oklahoma, and even more so, the earthquake in that pagan land, Japan, as somehow God's punishment, it's important for us who know about a God of love to remember who we are and to be honest about it. In a society which rejects most of the people in this room, if we were honest about ourselves, it is important for us to remember who we are and to whom we belong. In a society that is bent on injustice in so many different forms and fashions and calls into question anyone who thinks differently, it is important for you and for me to remember the one what's going to come. It's about how Jesus dealt with what happened right before. And when I think of Lent, my focus is not so much on sin and giving things up, but remembering how Lent came into being, which was bringing people into the church and giving them a new sense of identity. And then the rest of the church saying, we want that too. We want to remember again who it is that we are and who we belong to and the difference that makes. So as we walk through this season, whether you fast or feast, take some new project on,